Hi, I am Sweetie. The first time I saw Ethan, he was laughing with my husband over a shared joke I wasn't privy to. There was something magnetic about him, the way he carried himself, confident yet easygoing. I dismissed it then, a fleeting observation, nothing more. After all, I was happily married. At least, I had convinced myself I was. For 7 years, Daniel and I had built a life that looked perfect from the outside. We had a beautiful home, steady routines, and an unspoken understanding that marriage was less about passion and more about partnership. I used to believe that love settled into comfort, that silence at dinner was simply familiarity rather than detachment. But the silence had grown heavier lately, stretching beyond the dinner table into the very foundation of our marriage. I noticed it in the way Daniel barely looked up from his phone when I spoke, in how his goodnight kisses had become absent-minded pecks, in the way our conversations had become logistical rather than intimate. We still functioned, still played the part of a happy couple, but something essential had faded. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if he noticed, or if he cared. Then there was Ethan. He had been Daniel's closest friend for years, but only recently had he started visiting more often. He was charming in a way Daniel used to be, quick with a joke, always making sure to include me in conversations. He asked about my work, my interests, small things Daniel hadn't asked about in months. It was subtle, but I felt it. The way his attention filled the spaces my husband left empty. One evening, after dinner, I found myself alone with Ethan while Daniel took a work call. We sat in the dim glow of the living room, the air heavy with unsaid words. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle, observant. I almost laughed. It had been so long since someone had asked me that with genuine interest. "Yeah," I said automatically, then hesitated. "I mean, I don't know." He studied me for a moment, then simply nodded, as if he understood more than I was willing to say. Daniel returned moments later, oblivious, and the moment between Ethan and me evaporated like mist in the morning sun. But something had shifted that night. As I lay beside my husband, staring at the ceiling while he scrolled through his phone, I realized something unsettling. For the first time in our marriage, I wasn't sure if I wanted him to reach for me. And worse, I wasn't sure if I cared that he didn't. The thought lingered, unsettling yet undeniable. And with it, a dangerous question took root in my mind, one I wasn't ready to answer. Just why it started with small things. A lingering glance, a touch that lasted a second too long, a casual joke wrapped in something heavier. Ethan never crossed a line, at least, not one I could clearly define. But I felt the shift between us, the way his presence lingered even after he was gone. Daniel remained oblivious. If anything, he welcomed Ethan's frequent visits, sometimes even urging me to entertain him while he worked late or handled business calls. "You two get along so well," he said one evening, barely looking up from his laptop. "I'm glad you have someone to talk to." Something about the way he said it stung. Did he not realize how lonely I'd been? Or worse, did he know and simply not care? Ethan, on the other hand, noticed everything. "You've been quiet," he observed one afternoon, his gaze searching mine. I hesitated. "Just tired." His lips quirked in a knowing smile. "You always say that." I turned away, focusing on the coffee I was making, but I could feel him watching me. There was something about his attention, undistracted, unhurried, that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in a long time. One evening, the three of us sat on the patio, Daniel recounting a work story while Ethan and I listened. It should have been a normal night. But then, Daniel's phone rang, and just like that, he was gone, retreating into the house without a second thought. Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. "Does he always do that?" I let out a small laugh, though it held no real humor. "Lately?" "Yeah." A pause. Then, softer, "And that doesn't bother you?" I wanted to say no. I wanted to act like it didn't. But my silence spoke for me. The night air was thick with something unspoken. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the quiet invitation in the way he leaned just slightly closer. My pulse quickened, my mind screaming at me to move, to say something, to break whatever was happening between us. Instead, I let the moment stretch. "I should go," Ethan murmured, his voice lower now, almost reluctant. I nodded, but neither of us moved. Then, finally, he stood, his movements slow, deliberate. As he passed, his fingers brushed against mine, so slight it could have been accidental. But we both knew better. I stayed there long after he left, staring at my hand where his touch still burned. Inside, Daniel was still on the phone, his voice distant. Unconcerned. I told myself this was nothing. A harmless moment. A meaningless touch, but I knew better, and deep down, I also knew this wasn't the end of it.
The days that followed were filled with a strange tension, as if the air in the house had thickened, charged with something neither of us dared name. Caleb and I avoided being alone together, yet our paths always seemed to cross, too often to be coincidence. A glance across the dinner table, an accidental brush of shoulders in the hallway, lingering conversations that never quite crossed the line but hovered dangerously close. I could feel it, something shifting inside me. The emotional distance from my husband had long ago become a chasm, one neither of us tried to bridge anymore. He came home late, left early, and when we did speak it was clipped and cold. If he noticed the change in me, he didn't show it. In his world, I was a fixture, a silent, predictable presence. But Caleb, he saw the cracks, the weariness, the quiet longing I tried so hard to bury. And slowly, despite every voice in my head warning me, I found myself drawn to him, pulled into a gravity I couldn't resist. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen drying dishes, I felt his presence before I heard him. Caleb leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching me with a gaze that felt both familiar and entirely new. "You're quiet," he said. "I've had a lot on my mind," I replied, not turning to face him. He stepped closer, his voice softer now. "About the other night?" I nodded, setting down the dish towel. It was a moment. We were both vulnerable. He didn't speak right away, and when I finally met his eyes, I saw something unspoken flicker there: uncertainty, desire, guilt. All tangled together. "I haven't stopped thinking about it," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart raced. I should have walked away, changed the subject, anything to avoid what I knew was coming. But I stood still, rooted in place, unable to move. "Caleb, we can't." "I know," he said quickly. "I know it's wrong. But that doesn't change how I feel." His words hung heavy between us, undeniable now. There was no going back to the easy companionship we once shared. The line was still there, but it was thin, frayed, barely holding. "I'm not asking for anything," he continued, stepping closer, his eyes searching mine. "I just needed you to know." I swallowed hard, my emotions a whirlwind of confusion and temptation. "This can't happen," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. He nodded, backing away, respectful despite the storm between us. "I'll keep my distance. I promise." As he turned to leave, I felt a pang of something I didn't want to name: regret, maybe. Or the sinking realization that the decision wasn't as final as I wanted it to be. For weeks, we lived in the shadow of that unspoken truth. Caleb's confession hanging between us like an unfinished sentence. He kept his promise, maintaining distance, but I felt the shift in every glance, every fleeting moment of silence that once held comfort but now pulsed with tension. I tried to throw myself into routine, meals, errands, the sterile hum of daily life. But it all felt hollow, mechanical. My husband's presence was a ghostly echo. He didn't ask questions, didn't notice the strained air or the silence at the dinner table. In his world, I still filled the role of wife, nothing more. But in mine, I was unraveling. One night, the weight of it all became too much. I stepped outside, hoping the cool night air would ground me. The sky was cloudless, stars scattered like distant lanterns, and the world was quiet. Except for footsteps, familiar ones. Caleb stood at the edge of the porch, hesitant. "Didn't mean to disturb you." "You didn't," I said softly. We stood in silence for a moment, the distance between us thick with everything we hadn't said since that night. Finally, I turned to him. "This isn't fair to either of us." "I know," he said, his voice raw. "But pretending nothing's changed doesn't make it true." I looked away, my chest tight. He was right. We were both caught in a storm of emotions we hadn't asked for. The connection between us wasn't born from recklessness, it had crept in slowly, fed by neglect, silence, and unmet needs. "I care about you," I admitted, the words trembling on my lips. "But caring isn't enough. Not like this." Caleb nodded, eyes glistening with restraint. "I just wanted you to feel seen. Even if I can't be the one to give you what you deserve." There it was, clarity. Not desire, not temptation, but recognition. He wasn't asking for more. He was offering understanding. A mirror to the loneliness I'd carried in silence. I stepped closer, placing a hand gently on his arm. "Thank you for seeing me." It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a moment of closure, quiet and profound. He smiled faintly, then turned and walked away, leaving me in the stillness of the night. As I watched him disappear into the darkness, I felt a strange sense of peace. The storm had passed not with destruction but with resolution. And though the path ahead remained uncertain, I knew I could face it with clearer eyes and a steadier heart.